Next up is our keynote speech. Christina Marizzi, an award-winning scientist and educator. I've met her pretty much exactly a year ago around the UNGA. I was very fascinated by her important and very interesting work. Let me just present her to you a little bit. She currently serves as the Director of Community Science at BioBus. That's an organization that helps K-12 and college students discover, explore, and pursue science. It's very much an outreach project. She holds a PhD in genetics from the University of Vienna. And since 2015, she has directed a teaching laboratory and co-developed several signature citizen science programs around biodiversity in New York City. They have a big program also in Central Park, if I remember correctly. And she's also a scientific advisor to the New York City school system. So, Christina, we're all looking forward to your speech.
So thank you so much for your kind introduction. And yes, I also was allowed to actually have visual aids or slides, which I really appreciate. I'm here, and I'm, again, super excited to speak to a room of scientists and Austrian delegation, hopefully all supporters of science. Sometimes, you have to ask because you never know, right? But I was actually asked to set the stage for a fruitful day of discussions about, how can we, increase public trust in science, right? I dare not to comment too much about democracy because it's not my personal background, but I think these two are intertwined, as you can see. And I'm just gonna see where the next one. Do I click the arrow or not? Yes. Yeah, so what I plan to talk about is basically, I would like to talk about science engagement because sharing information, as we all saw, is not enough. We need to get people interested in science, which can also lead to science engagement, which is the best way to actually have people understanding and participating in the scientific process. Then I'm going to loop into trust and transparency, which I think are one of the key elements in meaningful science communication and building trust in science. And then I present one of the solutions. Again, this is informed from my personal work as a science communicator and outreach specialist. It is cultural responsive communication, and also I will close out for the right to science, which I usually highlight. It's not coming up a lot in everybody's work, but I usually talk about this, especially when reaching out to marginalized communities. So science is everywhere. Again, I'm speaking here on preaching the course, you say, right? I think most of you really will agree, it allowed huge advancements in technology and in medicine. It increases our fundamental knowledge, how we see the world, how we engage with the world. It also creates new technology. It dreams up new applications. We just heard, there's an investment in, can we have more spin-off companies, coming out of universities, right? And then it's also, for me, it's a pathway of shared ideas. It's not one idea that's actually, solving the world. Collaboration is just super important. And as we are still in the middle of an ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, I hope the WHO is going to call off the pandemic pretty soon, but again, there's still work to be done. It again shows, in a time of crisis, how scientists and how the world can come together to really tackle our biggest issues in the world, right? When funding is not an issue, when all the time is invested in solving one problem, a lot of things actually can happen. The pandemic also has significantly altered how science is conducted. The speed of how information is shared is incredible. It's also shared open access, online. Again, we have to speak here about the digital divide because not everybody has actually access to an internet where, all information is shared, right? But if you can, and if you can read, which is another thing we also have to address globally, you can actually see what information is actually happening in the lab. And at the same time, face masks became a political issue. And that's also very interesting, how people follow science and what is actually, where do people start criticizing science, right? Very often when it actually comes into government policies and applications to your personal life. So when science is everywhere and science is everywhere in our daily life, let's discuss how do people think, feel, and about science and scientists itself. And I want to start with some numbers. I'm a scientist. And there are actually many studies out there. And again, full disclosure, this is not my main specialty, right? I'm a trained geneticist, and my background is in science communication. But I just picked two, which I think, bring up some meaningful points. The studies that I picked today more or less tell the same story. One of them is more focused on the European level, one of them is more focused on the United States level. And they both talk about science and science engagement, again, which is for me like a segue, how to build trust in science. And the first study, conducted in 2021 or 2022 by the Kafli Foundation, has a nice sample size from close to 3,000 participants. Again, it wanted to better understand how Americans' interest and engagement in science actually happens. And the numbers are great. It found that 94%, which is a really high number according to the study, are interested in science. That alone is fantastic, right? Curiosity was one of the main factors. Curiosity means how to spark imagination, and it's just a sense of wonder. Mastery, I want to gain knowledge by myself and skills. Joy, it actually is fun to do science. It feels good, which is a super great factor. Autonomy, I can do it on my own. This is where the biohacker, biomaker scene comes in, my personal reflection. And then also recharging. Science is a hobby for a couple of people. We just mentioned, science, communication outreach, where it happens, well, I have this iNaturalist app, and I see this bird, and I wonder what it is. So it is actually really great to do this in my own time, and it's physically, mentally, and emotionally recharging. Hopefully it's for a lot of scientists here in the room as well, right? I mean, I have fun doing science. So interestingly, curiosity comes up equally across gender, race, ethnicity, income, geography, education, and political ideology. So the point I want to make here is curiosity is actually only one factor. It comes up across the border, right? But when you look at differences, it's drilling a bit deeper in the question if curiosity actually leads to engagement with science. And while there seems to be a clear correlation between curiosity and connection and willingness to engage, it really differs, at least in the United States, according to the study, based on racial and ethnic groups. White adults said, well, curiosity is my main factor. I just want to see how stuff works. Black adults reported it's actually the connection, a deep personal connection and being part of something bigger. And Hispanic adults said, well, it's a little bit of both. It's a mix between a curiosity and connection. And in other words, while curiosity seems to be a main factor, high curiosity actually doesn't really mean that we have effective engagement with science. So we really have to look tailor our message every single time, which leads to the question, who actually has access to science, right? And again, 59% according to the study wanted to spend more time with science, which just means 94% are interested. The majority wants to do more, right? And what are the barriers? What is actually keeping you away from engaging with science? And again, science engagement ranged from reading articles, reading a newspaper, listening to a podcast, doing research in a free time to actually being part of a clinical trial, which if you have ever been part of a clinical trial, it's a huge investment of time. Even if you are compensated for your time, you have to get in multiple times over several years. So why are we not seeing more engagement? And it really ranges from logistics to values, belonging, and identity. Logistics, if you have a family of 4 and it costs you 100 euros or dollars to go to a science museum, you might not be able to afford it very often, right? Especially in a time when everything gets more expensive. Some people also report, well, I don't see a value in going to a museum or read up on science. I really find it boring, or I don't understand what this is all about, right? So I'm just gonna turn to other means, which is actually more fun to follow, right? It could be social media. Some people said, I feel uncomfortable asking questions about the topics I don't know about. How do we increase the confidence of people who partake in science, to ask questions, not being afraid to ask questions, not being afraid to appear to be not knowledgeable about science. And then identity. Science activities don't reflect contributions of people with background like mine, which loops into this is all about white old men. I'm a young Latina in science. Why should I care, right? So the barriers, again, you see, like, are variable. Some of them are easy to fix by adequate funding, right? Some of them are like harder to, like, tackle. And the barriers related to feelings of belonging or identity, they have a greater impact, again, on the marginalized communities in Americas, for sure, like, which is African Americans and Hispanic communities. And those demographics are, along with American Indian, Pacific Islanders, Hawaiian natives, and persons of disabilities, they're the same that have been historically been underrepresented in science. And we need them in science because we're missing them out in our STEM talent pools. So those barrier statements, they also tell for me the story that participation sometimes does not always indicate the absence of barriers, right? They might not even exist. But instead, they may be the result of an individual choice or work to overcome them. If you are Latina, again, engaging in science, and you make the time to sign up for a clinical trial because for you personally, like, it matters to represent, then you really have to think about this person had to put in twice the effort just to be there. And that's just the starting ground. Okay, let's look to Europe. I think some people in this room actually might know this study. It also has been discussed, like, in Austrian media a while ago. It's the famous special European study 516 with more than 37,000 one-to-one interviews. It also came out as the previous study that I showed, like, in the middle of the pandemic, so in a time when, like, vaccines became available. And it's just the numbers, again, they are, for me personally, are promising because you see, again, more than 80% are interested in science and technology, and many of them want to learn more. So a great starting point. And respondents often mention, well, healthcare and medical care and fight against, like, climate change when asked which areas of research and innovation can make a difference. Again, the first one is not surprising because this was done during the vaccine availability, right? When all kind of, like, values were out there, and climate change is just really, like, important for people, especially younger ones. And this is the same information, just showing since 2010, the last time the study was conducted, we do see a slight increase in European citizens' interest in science and feeling informed about science. So, however, interest does still not translate to feeling informed, but again, where we still see a gap. But, interest in science, like, became bigger between 2010 and the last time the study was conducted. So, let's go to some more numbers, which I want to highlight here. So, interest in medical discoveries increased in most member states. And the European average is, like, at 38%. Austria, like, is at the lower half, is 33%. Again, I want to point out we still had a 10% increase since that time, which is, I think, very encouraging. And the highest ranking numbers are Portugal, Cyprus, Belgium, and Portugal was one of the lowest ranking countries just 10 years ago. Within 10 years, they actually saw a 55% jump. So I think we can look deeper into what did this country implement and do, like what kind of strategies did they have, because size and population-wise, we are not that different, right? Geography, of course, but there might be some lessons and take-home messages for us. And again, the same pattern can be seen here. This is the question about, like, would you like to learn more about scientific development? This is just learning, not engagement. And again, in Austria, only 11% would like to learn more about science, and it is, like, 36% in Portugal. I did not include the numbers that you have the tendency to think about something, which is like the light blue, like, bar right above. I just really was pointing to, like, well, somebody's confident about what I would like to do this, which is like 11% in Austria. So when the general interest is like that low, because I personally think 11 out of 100 people being interested is not that high, especially if this study was done during the pandemic when the vaccine rollout was there. How can the science community foster deeper connections with non-scientists? Because that's what you're talking about. And yeah, this is a huge topic. And I just want to bring up some major points here. We also have a full day ahead of us, so please, like, discuss further and also find me to discuss further about some points. So I think, first of all, adequate funding is critical. Funding for science and scientific infrastructure so the scientists in Austria can do the best work possible. We just heard, like, there's excellent research happening, but only a quarter, like, gets funded. So I think there might be some room of improvement here. But I also, like, see that we have some regulations here. It also includes, like, science education from kindergarten to university and beyond. Science education in third spaces, which means outside of schools, at innovative areas like, empty buildings, for example. And then also, like, it also includes, for me, institutional integrity. Then the next one, which is like the culturally responsive education, for me, it's like tailored science communication that goes away from, like, I am a scientist, I have all the knowledge, and I will come to you and tell you something. This is like the paradigm of, like, we have to close a gap. We need to have an honest and respectful dialogue. And I do understand, like, it's hard to get somebody talking to you when they don't, like, trust in science and believe. But again, sometimes you don't have to disclose that you're a scientist. You can have a common, like, you can have a common conversation with somebody when you go fishing or when you just go to a farmer's market, right? You can always, like, do this kind of, like, tailored knowledge. At the last ARIT in DC, Dieter Pfoser, and I think he's not here, he actually shared a really great example. His university had like vaccine trucks. They were planning to go out to the community. And instead of like the 500 people that wanted to vaccinate that single day, nobody, like literally nobody showed up. And that's a classic example of, like, well, the community they wanted to serve, they didn't even speak English. They actually were using a certain specific Mayan dialect. So again, language barriers, we have to be mindful about how we reach out to those communities. I was also mentioned, like, at BioBus, I'm the PI of the New York City Virus Hunters that actually brings science and society together by empowering students to partake in pandemic preparedness by literally going out and sample wild birds for viruses, including influenza virus and Newcastle disease, which can have a huge economic impact in the future. And I dreamt up this program because the students were, like, very frightened about what's happening, but they felt powerless and they wanted to be part of something, right? And then once they know and understand the scientific process, they can bring this back to the families. And a lot of them actually ended up as vaccine ambassadors because they understood, like, how a vaccine is made, but also, like, how influenza can jump from wild birds to humans. Yeah, and then community science, which is just the example I shared, like, work with the community and find that little aspect of your research that they care about. There's always something people wonder, especially if they're interested in science. There's always always something that people want to learn more about. And I do not want to exclude, like, science journalism here because I think it's very important. Personally, there's this question: who should communicate science, right? Is it a journalist? Is it a scientist? I personally think it is the responsibility of scientists to communicate science in a way, or at least, like, do the effort in a way that it actually can, be understood by people. And that's, like, that support in high quality science journalism is sometimes very easy. If you're a scientist and you have somebody, like, contacting you, make the effort, the 5 minutes, by just reading through an article that you get sent, because you are the best in the field. You know if this is something you can just look further into, right? A journalist might spend hours just, like, trying to find out, is this something to investigate further? So really make that effort. You can do this through social media, you can do an email, it can be a phone call, but I think it's just really very important. And yeah, scientists are also, like, super busy. I do understand this, but again, I think it's your responsibility to clearly communicate science. And speaking to the press is only one way. You can also, like, turn to social media like we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can also do, like, speak to smaller groups, do science comedy, or express yourself through art. Okay, so while doing so, I wanted to remind scientists that in the room that it is actually okay to make a statement that is correct today and which turns out not to be correct maybe tomorrow or in the near future. Because for me, that is a tension point, right? We are a little bit afraid of, like, well, I say something based on the current knowledge, and then I do get criticized, right, or attacked by people because, well, why didn't you say it like yesterday? Today, everything is, like, different. I think the more people, like, like, again, it is a challenge to explain complex topics very simple in an adjustable way, but it's also like important to educate people, or like, invite people to understand more about the scientific process. And I do this every single day. I do it over and over again, and I do so cheerfully, because the more people understand about the scientific process, the easier like building trust in science, because they perceive you as transparent and honest every single time is going to work out. Okay, so let's say you are a scientist turning to social media to talk about your research, right? So where do people find information? Which is also, I think, it's something you have to really think about deeply. While you're spreading the word about your research, with the rise of digital technology, well, we all have our cell phones and we have all our apps installed, right? It actually works with certain algorithms. It's no wonder that getting information through social media is actually really on the rise. And this trend is actually strongest in the most adaptable part of our society, which is our youth, or like even our teenagers or young adults. And teens today, they are not only getting the majority of information about social networks online, they're actually turning away from traditional media, which I think is something we have to consider when you are trying to convey a message and you're competing to influencers, celebrities, right, that actually might even spread misinformation and information. How do we go about this? And even further, right, if those teenagers, they will grow up, right, and they're gonna probably not change the habit, they will cast a ballot. They will be our future like voters. So if there's no trust in science and democracy, like, it's actually going to have a real political impact. I would like to close out with something again that I mentioned that really comes up a lot in my work. And this is like the Article 27.1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you haven't read those recently, it's always a great read. I give you permission to leave the room and look it up. It's actually around since 1948, and actually really says science is a human right. The access to science is a human right. And we are all, like, have a right to share in the scientific advancement. It's also its benefits. And again, when I speak to especially marginalized communities, they wonder, is there a space for me in science? And then very often they hear, well, yeah, isn't that a human right? And around since 1948, and why, I do still feel not being part of science. I think we can just bring this more to the forefront. And even, like, brought this even further by Article 15 in the ICSCR that states, everyone has the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. Which is, like, the implication is that governments must adopt measures to respect and ensure that the right to science. And the existence of this right is important for researchers and for the society. It adds a legal and moral dimension to a range of fundamental issues, including scientific freedom, funding, policy, as well to the access to data, materials, and knowledge. So again, I close up with, like, science is everywhere, and science is and should be for everyone. Let us make every effort to make it robust, inclusive, and responsible. That I would like to thank you for your patience, and if you need further resources, either take a snapshot of the barcode or find me over coffee, and I look very much forward to talk to you today. Thank you.